Hi, and welcome to our lecture on the domains of learning. My name is Clark Imus, and I'll be facilitating our online lecture. Let's go ahead and jump in. One of the first things we have to understand as instructors is the definition of pedagogy. Pedagogy is defined as the art and science of teaching. We know that the art of teaching involves a lot of creative aspects, things that are a little bit different than the typical science aspects that you would see. Now, we also have sciences of teaching, which is based on the educational psychology and research of proven practices and methodologies and processes to allow for us to have a framework to understand how learners learn and how learners progress. These are typically referenced through different learning theories and specific learning preferences. We also are going to reflect on how people think. When we use the concept of metacognition or thinking or analyzing how one thinks, it's going to help us inform us to become a better instructor. We're also going to need to understand what the domains of learning are and how those apply to the different aspects of the skills and content in which you will instruct. Now, when we think about the domains of learning, first, these are the tools for understanding how people think, feel, and act. We know that understanding domains allows for better planning, for a better depth and breadth of the material. And we know that can oftentimes be challenging when we look at our national education standards, as they don't prescribe specific learning objectives, rather they provide the breadth, so the scope, and then the depth, how significant the material is. What is the depth of that material that you're going to be covering, right? So again, it's going to outline what needs to be taught and how far we need to get in or to go through that material, depending on the license level we're instructing. Now, the domains of learning were developed by Benjamin Bloom back in 1956, and they are a major area for learning and thinking. It allows for us to be able to have a framework to be able to understand how individuals learn, whether if it's a psychomotor skill, a professional or behavior attribute, or learning from the cognitive learning domain. Now, these domains of learning are used in the instructional design process to be able to write goals and objectives, and that's really important. It means that we're going to be able to determine the breadth and the depth of the issue that we're going to cover, and for instructors, it allows for us to be able to use that goals and objectives to tie back to our assessments, the way in which we can develop test items or test questions and go through that test item writing analysis by blueprinting our exam or outlining our exam based on specific objectives to make sure that we're getting the adequate breadth and depth of the assessment of the material we've instructed to our students. Now, you're going to hear me mention Bloom's taxonomy a lot, and I'm a big fan of Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy, as a student progresses through the different levels, they obtain a deeper and fuller understanding of the material as we go from bottom aspect, lower level thinking, up to higher ordered or higher level thinking. Now, there are two strategies that we use for classifying levels. The first is lower and higher levels, right? The first two levels of each domain are going to be considered to be lower, and then as the levels continue to move up, they're going to be considered to be higher. This is a lot of times very confusing for students because there's a greater area of subjectivity and there's no real true division points between those strategies of higher and lower levels. We'll talk about that a little bit as well too. The second aspect is a three-level system, and this is one that's pretty common. It is the primary three buckets we would see, which include knowledge, application, and problem solving. And I'll go through each one of those as we go through. The first is your knowledge level. Your knowledge level is going to allow for you to comprehend facts and procedures and feelings. These are going to be ways in which we can measure simple skills or through thought processes. Once we get to the application level, now it's going to build upon a previous foundation, right? So we have our knowledge aspect, and now we're getting into that application next level. This, again, is going to involve integration and execution of principles and procedures and values. There's a little bit more that's going on with this. We have a base level of information, and now we're applying it. Our personal experiences, our attitudes, oftentimes will play a role into this from a student's perspective. Lastly, it includes precision in the skill execution, the application of the principles and the values and feelings and beliefs that we expect to see from students who have reached that level of application. So again, we started out at that lower level, and now we progress to that second level, which is application. Our final level is going to be problem solving. This builds upon the application level, which builds upon the knowledge, right? And it indicates that mastery of the content, mastery of the skills, the material you're instructing has been achieved. It involves analysis or analyzing information, procedures, and feelings. This is a great way to think about how your students are going to begin to grow and progress. We want them to be at that problem-solving level before they go out to be able to do skills or to be able to work independently as a practitioner, I should say. Now, the problem-solving level, at the farthest point of this level, the student is capable of metacognition, right? That ability to critically think about how one thinks, right? Analysis of how we think and how we act and why we do what we do, right? Thinking about thinking is probably the best definition I can give you for metacognition, or thinking about how one learns in education. Now, language of objective will clue you into the level and depth of the level and depth and breadth, that's covered in the material. And we're going to have to use some specific verbs in order for us to be able to truly provide that objective, which is going to actually allow for us to have something that's specific, that is going to be measurable, attainable, achievable, right? All those aspects, timely, all those aspects of being a SMART goal, we've got to start to think about when we write objectives, when we're really starting to get into that level. What are we using to describe what we're doing? For example, there's a clear difference between reviewing information and describing information, right? How do you measure tangibly a review, right? Like, it's really difficult to just like review something and then have your students be like, well, I reviewed it. Well, how much do you know? How can you quantify that? You can't. But if you were to use a more common verb of things like, or a more specific verb of describe specific components of X, Y, or Z, that's measurable, right? We can see how well the student described that. It's very hard to see how well someone reviewed something. So the terms in which we use, the verbs in which we use, do make a difference. So some common cognitive verbs that you may see will be define, to know, to describe, design, analyze, discuss, and identify are all some pretty common ones you might see. At the psychomotor level, now again, we're talking about application generally. So can they demonstrate? Can they show? Can they perform or conduct, right? And then at that highest level, that affective learning, those behaviors, that professional attributes, can they do things like defend an argument or appreciate a specific aspect, value or model a specific behavior? Those are some of the things that we can see. Now, these three primary levels that we think of, cognitive, psychomotor, and affective, are wonderful aspects that Bloom utilizes to say in each one of those. I keep using a sign of a pyramid. I'll give you an example of the picture of what that looks like in a second. But this idea of building from the bottom up is very, very important. However, there are some parts of this that you cannot just push students through these levels. If they've not prepared at the cognitive level, then they're not ready to move on to the psychomotor or application or so on or so forth. You have to allow for them to move through the levels at their own speed with guidance, right? If you push a student through too fast these levels, they're not going to learn the material. They're going to make mistakes. You're not going to have the retention of the content that you're going to want to see, and they're not going to be able to draw on it later on in life when they really need to in a critical high stress like environment. When we look at the cognitive domain, we're first looking at didactic information. You may have heard me say something along that throughout the lessons here, but didactic information is knowledge and facts, right? When we think of a lecture such as this is the didactic presentation. We're talking predominantly about facts and knowledge. Now, within that cognitive domain, there are 6 levels of sophistication, right? So again, each of these levels that we're going to start to talk about are going to have that knowledge aspect, the application, and the problem solving, right? That's the general flow that's going to occur for each of these. And then we're going to have within that, that's our progression or our 3 buckets within each style, right? So then we have cognitive, we then have psychomotor, and then we have affective. And within each of those, there are multiple levels as well too. This can be kind of confusing, but we'll try to get through it as easily as possible. So level 1, when we're talking about cognitive learning, is knowledge. Knowledge is memorization, recall. Can you get generalized facts and figures down? Oftentimes when I see test results or do a test analysis, sometimes our students will do very well on the highest, most difficult concepts of the questions, things that require you to be able to put lots of things together to answer it. But oftentimes they may fail or miss or do poorly on the lower level objectives, specifically where they have to memorize facts and figures, right? You want to know what the normal end tidal is for a patient, or normal blood glucose range. Those are things that you just generally have to memorize and be able to recall. That's that base level. The next level we see is comprehension. And comprehension is where we're going to start to be able to have an interpretation and really a true meaning or understanding behind the information. Doesn't mean we can do it. It doesn't mean that we can problem solve through it. What it's really referring to is that the knowledge we have, we understand that knowledge, right? It's not just I can tell you what a normal end tidal is, or I can tell you what a blood glucose range is, but now I can start to understand what the meaning behind is for that, right? So it's another level up. Your third level for the cognitive learning domain is application. And application is going to be based on applying what you've learned within the classroom to real life situation and experiences. Oftentimes we'll see this in the form of skill training. It could be in the form of a simulation or a scenario, right? It could be a verbal scenario or tabletop, physical, it wouldn't really matter at this point, but we're talking about the knowledge. So now they have knowledge that they can then apply to that specific search situation. So they have, again, knowledge, then comprehension of that knowledge, and now they can apply that knowledge and comprehension to real life situations and experiences. Now, analysis is your next level. Analysis is level 4. This is going to be the separation of what you'll refer to as whole, part, whole, oftentimes, where you can take an item in its entirety and you can break it down into the individualized steps, and you can start to be able to understand each individualized part and piece to really understand what their meaning is, or what the importance or value behind their meaning is. Again, you're analyzing certain circumstances, right? Something is put in front of you, and you've got to be able to break it down and figure out what's your number one priority, right? Those aspects will be an example of and analyzing what their meaning is and understanding their relative importance, okay? Level 5 is where now you're getting into synthesis, and this is where now you can start to take those bits and pieces that you broke down, and now we can start to recombine those pieces of information into a new or a completely different product. This is where students are going to be able to take something that they understand or have participated in and now truly be able to go back and do it again, but do it almost with their own style and their own flair to it. They are so comfortable with the information that's being presented that now they can create something with it, that they can be more creative than they have been able to previously. And then the last aspect you're going to get into is going to be evaluation. And this is where students are going to be able to make judgments and decisions about what they're learning and be able to make rational decisions based off the information that's presented to them, right? So when something is put in front of you and it's not normal, let's say it's a simulation experience and a student walks in and they're expected to perform, but it's something different than what they anticipated, can they take those pieces and parts that are normally organized, reorganize them, and then make judgments based off of that, right? That's the evaluation from that. And then they begin to make those decisions as far as that will go. That's a very high level of learning. And so really, those are going to be some of the big aspects that we're going to take a look at here. So now that we've had a chance to kind of go through those levels, I want to show you how this information for Bloom's taxonomy will differ from current trends in education. And it's important because the test that you're going to be taking for the IC is going to be utilizing Bloom's taxonomy from 1956, not the current 2001 version that's most common. But again, I want you to kind of understand some of that level that you'll see. The steps are the same regardless of the pyramid, right? But the concept is going to be a little bit easier to understand under the 2001 model versus the 1956. Again, regardless, knowledge is your base level, right? So your 6 levels of sophistication start with knowledge. That's the base level. Do you have facts and figures? Can you memorize information? Comprehension. Now we're talking about can you recall that information, right, and understand what value it may have. Under application, now you're applying those skills, right? You're able to, again, take those concepts and begin to make basic assumptions and be able to apply those specific information and knowledge that you have and understand to those various components. Analysis is going to be where you're able to identify components and be able to understand the different aspects where you can, in essence, begin to list the pieces and parts that exist within that process or that thought. And then synthesis is the ability to break that apart and then begin to redesign it. And our last is evaluation, which evaluation is the highest level of learning, and that's where all of that information allows for you to make better and more informed decisions when dealing with new problems. I love this image. I use this image every time we do a new student orientation where I'm talking about the importance of understanding Bloom's taxonomy, and you're probably going to go, geez, you make your students actually learn this, but I think it's important, right? Again, knowledge, memorizing basic information, being able to remember but not necessarily fully understand the material that's in front of them. Comprehension, now you're starting to restate the information in your own words. You can paraphrase, you can summarize, you can translate it. And then as under application, now you're using information to start to solve problems, right? You're starting to, again, begin to understand transfer abstract or theoretical ideas to practical situations. You're identifying connections and relationships and how they apply. That's the application. Analysis, now you're identifying components. You are determining arrangements. You're turning logic. You're going over semantics, right? You're really kind of saying, what makes sense? So should we rearrange these things, right? You understand patient assessment well enough, you can start to analyze. Maybe there's a different approach depending on your own flavor, right? Synthesis, now you're combining all that information to make your own product, something new, right? You understand the components of assessment so well, you now can make it into your own physical outline of how you would do an assessment, right? You've synthesized that. And evaluation is when you're going to be in situations that maybe the way you've used your patient assessment won't work. And so you're going to have a new understanding, a new value, a new approach to this where you're actually making decisions based off all the material and all the information that's in front of you. Again, when you're going to be talking about these levels and these basic aspects, you're going to see them broken down into that lowest level of knowledge, more to our application, and then to our problem solving as it continues to scroll up higher and higher. Again, your lower levels here is going to be knowledge, then you're going to get into application, and then you get into problem solving. That's a generic flow no matter what type of specific learning domain we're getting into. Okay, so again, there's three phases to each aspect of Bloom's, right? So again, this is the cognitive aspect. There are 6 steps for this, but there's always those 3 basic steps that are going to move from knowledge to application to problem solving. That's the general flow, no matter what it might be. All right, now, if we look at the psychomotor domain, this is going to be a little bit different. Now, when we're talking about the psychomotor learning domain, we're dealing with skills, actions, and manual manipulation. Let's take a look at what these 5 levels look like when we're talking about the psychomotor learning domain. Our first level is going to be imitation. Thank you. The student learns by watching and copying, right? This is oftentimes where you'll hear the concept of this of show one, do one, teach one, or whole, part, whole is another way you may see that explained. The show one, do one, teach one is where you show, you're shown what's information, right? You get a chance to practice that, and then you actually go to teach it, which is going to lead you up to that higher level in Bloom's when it comes to psychomotor learning domain. Regardless of your approach, the concepts are relatively the same. You're going to start out with imitation and then move from there into manipulation. And manipulation is where now your actions are performed through memorization or by following instructions. A lot of times we're going to be using our skill sheets to be helping us to be able to do some manipulation. From there we go to precision. Precision is where we're doing performance aspects, right? To see that performance becomes more of an expert style. Actions are going to be much more precise. We know that we're at the point where we're now honing in the skills that we're doing. The next level is articulation. These are going to be several different skills that can be performed together. You think of this in the form of a simulation or a more of a summative evaluation, a summation of what is occurring. Maybe your students are starting to do patient assessment while assembling an oxygen tank and utilizing an AED and putting in an iGel if it was a cardiac arrest situation. That's going to be that level where they can start to be able to handle multiple skills performed simultaneously. And the last level is naturalization. And naturalization is the highest level of performance, and it achieves when actions become second nature. A great way to tell if someone has naturalization of a said skill, let's say innovation, and that is to have them sing a song or recite a poem while they are performing a said skill, right? So can they say the Pledge of Allegiance or Mary Had a Little Lamb or whatever it might be while they do all of that skill, to be able to focus on doing the skill while they're able to have their thought process performing something else, being somewhere else. That's the level of naturalization that we're looking for. Again, students are going to progress through these levels at their own pace, but nonetheless, we want to see them have that progression as they go through. And the way in which we scaffold our content and the way in which we lay out our lab experiences, those are going to be ways that we're going to be able to help students progress more so through this process of 5 levels. So let's take a look at each one of them together. The first is obviously intimidation. I said it again. Imitation is the word I'm looking for, and it's again repeated based on the examples that have been given. Nothing too crazy there. Level 2, now we're talking about manipulation. That's the practicing and creating one's own style as they begin to manipulate that content or material. And then for level 3 is precision. Now they can do the concepts without mistake, without having any feedback or interventions. Articulation, now they're proficient, they're competent, and they can perform the skill with their own flair, style, or flavor, if you will. And then the final level is going to be naturalizations, and that's going to be that mastery level of the skill without any type of cognition. They don't have to think about what they're doing. They're able to just do it, right? A lot of times you'll hear this referred to as muscle memory. It's a great tool for that. Now, the next level we have is the affective learning domain. So let me back up for a second. We've talked about the primary ways that we have growth as a learner, from understanding knowledge to application to problem solving. We've now described the steps of the cognitive learning domain, those 6 steps. We're now have identified the steps associated with the psychomotor, and now we're ready to get into the affective learning domain, which is really focusing on behaviors, beliefs, emotions, and how they impact your environment and the skills that you're performing, and to be honest, the professionalism that you're starting to impart onto your students. Now, the affective domain is the most difficult domain to teach. It is the most difficult domain to evaluate. It's not going to be something that you're going to be able to just automatically have every student fall perfectly into these, the progression from lower level to higher level or thinking. It's going to take a little bit more effort because each person is going to come with their own unique beliefs and backgrounds and attitudes already. Some people come with a clean, open slate. They're prepared to learn, and others are going to come with a lot of baggage where they think and have certain beliefs about what should be done, what's appropriate, what might not be appropriate, and that may not always line up with the content that you're instructing. So there is a real value in helping to shape these learners' beliefs and attitudes, because in our industry, professionalism is not a request, it's an expectation. And we want to do everything we can to be able to lean into that learning domain and to really help ensure that our profession is seen as professionals. Let's take a look at the domain. So again, there's 5 levels to this. They start off with the receiving or attending level. This is where one has to be willing to be receiving of information, right? They have to be willing to go into a certain situation. They have to be willing to experience certain aspects. It's based on choice, right? Are they going to actively participate? Are they going to be open to receiving information no matter what setting it might be? Your next level that you're looking at is going to be focusing heavily on responding. How willing is your participants? Are they obedient? Are they following through? Are they volunteering? Do they find that there's satisfaction in what they're doing by participating? Are your students ready to respond? Right? So they've got to be willing to receive the information, but they also have to be willing to respond, right? For a class to go effectively, there has to be a certain level of coexistence where you say something and they respond. That's important. Then we move up to valuing. This is a unique level because valuing is motivation, right? Are they motivated to invest in what they're doing? Can they choose between the behaviors that are easier, right, to do, or are they going to choose in the behaviors that are more valuable to them, right? So it's easy to have a poor attitude or to not want to persist or not have good time management, but it's important that they begin to identify those behaviors, commit to them, and then and then hold that commitment, establish that value. Our fourth level is organizing, and organizing is where values now are becoming systematic, where we can start to compare and contrast values, and we can compare and contrast our choices. We can start to think about what should we choose to commit to and what should we choose not to commit to as professionalism or behaviors, right? This is an example where maybe you give a case study to your students and you say, what would be the professional standards you would expect from this individual, right? Maybe it's a legal aspect where you're doing role playing and you're going to have them not have a good systematic understanding or to what they're doing because they don't really choose to commit to those said values or behaviors that we've established at the lower levels. And then our last level is going to be characterizing, and this is where acts consistently due to an internal belief system can truly articulate a philosophy, whether if it's something specific or not for that matter, but they can take something and really understand it from that person's perspective, right? Basically, can they characterize a situation as if they had to walk a mile in that individual's shoes, right? So if they can break that complex system down and then respond accordingly based on the core values, the core developments, and lives in essence by a code of ethics and morals, professional behavior, really, right, of what's expected of an EMS provider, then we know that they have met that level. But there has to be the understanding that there's more to your belief system than just what you receive or respond or value. And so, again, students are going to have to progress up through this, and you're going to see some of that's going to be effective based on knowledge, some of it's going to be based on application of those, in this case, behaviors or learned behaviors, and to the point where they actually can get into to feel the problem solve utilizing that professional standards. So to break it down a little bit more, Bloom's taxonomy, it's an affective learning domain. It's an emotion-based learning is really what we're looking at here. Receiving is your lowest level, again, awareness or value of the importance of the information, and that there is a willingness to learn. That's your base level. They have to be willing to learn. Level 2, they already have a willingness to actively participate, and they now can derive satisfaction from doing so. That's the responding, right? They're receiving the information, they're understanding it, and now they're starting to be able to understand that process is actually going to give me some self-satisfaction. That takes us to valuing. Again, we now recognize that behavior, that information we received, that we now understand, there's value to it, and perception is so important, right? Because without perception, value has no worth. So we want to make sure we recognize that. Level 4 is going to be at an organizational level. And again, we're talking about integration of different beliefs and reconciling differences, right? Now you can value in others' opinions, you can respond, you can receive, but more importantly, now you can organize that belief system. So you can start to recognize what might be appropriate or inappropriate depending on a said belief system, and then compare to that to what you should do as an EMS educator. And then the last level is characterization. And again, it's development of one's own value system that governs their own behavior. And again, that's learned, whether it's learned passively through the environment or if it's actively learned through instruction. Either way, it's going to be really important as far as that goes. Now, I want to go back over this one more time because I really do feel like this is important. And you're going to see some of these graphics I'm using. They may not all line up perfectly, but it's going to give us a pretty good understanding. Again, there are 3 primary learning domains that we're going to see within Bloom's taxonomy: cognitive, knowledge, affective, your behaviors, and psychomotor. Those are going to be your kinesthetic psychomotor skills, right? Again, your cognitive, you're looking at your base level of knowledge, followed by comprehension, application, then analysis, synthesis, evaluation. Your affective, we talked about receiving, responding, valuing, organizing, and characterization. And then for our psychomotor, we talked about, but again, it's still a very valuable aspect. I do want to reiterate that you're going to be tested on the 1956 version of Bloom's, not the updated terminology for Bloom's 2001. The big difference between the two is in Bloom's updated version, or the newest version, if you will, it moves from nouns into verbs, right? So to descriptions. That's probably the biggest way of it doing. So instead of utilizing nouns for the levels, we're now starting to use descriptions. So now there's a lot of different ways you can target your learning domain based on the way in which you instruct in the classroom. Let's dive into those. The first is cognitive, right? Obviously, lectures are one of the most efficient ways to be able to present information to a group of people. It's also the least interactive, and it's generally where the least amount of information is retained, but nonetheless, it does play a role. Discussion is another great option. It is more active when you're beginning to do a discussion, as long as all members are participating equally. When we have issues where not all members are actively participating, it's oftentimes difficult to have a very robust discussion. We also have to recognize reading is an important aspect. Not everyone retains material that they read, but those that are generally read writers do well. Linguistic learners, right? They do well through that aspect of being able to read and to interpret. So we can see that. Diagramming is another great way where you can be able to use anatomical diagramming, drawing, making images, and being a little bit more creative sometimes is a nice way to do that within the cognitive domain. Case studies. I love case studies. I like students to create case studies. I love video case studies. I just think that it's a very effective way to be able to immerse a student into a subject and be able to get them to develop their own critical thinking. We talk about that progression of learning, from knowledge, application to problem solving. You want to get through that climb. You're going to have to come up with unique ways to interact with your students. Just by passively telling them to read the book doesn't mean they're going to retain any of that information. But case studies oftentimes can. Drills are another one that you could do as well too. I'll sometimes do what's called last medic standing, and that's just for rapid ECG interpretation or ACLS algorithm steps. But it's a great way to be able to utilize some of that. Sometimes drills work well for some students. Sometimes it doesn't. Some students don't do well at all when you put them in front of a high stress environment like a drill. So recognize that there's different levels and different aspects of when it's appropriate to deploy those resources. Now, psychomotor, some big ones. Skill practice, right? Using skill sheets, building that basic foundation to make sure they understand the concepts that they're working with. We know that scenarios are a great way to do that. I'm a big believer in tabletop scenarios and in small scenarios. Sometimes I'll refer to them as simulettes. They're small versions of simulations. Obviously, you're going to have simulations as a big aspect of this, and you're going to see more and more so with national accreditation outlining the importance of simulation and how it should be utilized in initial education right now at the paramedic level, soon to be AEMT, and I would imagine at some point it will trickle on down to the rest of the levels. We're also seeing simulations and scenarios used at the MFR and EMT levels for the new psychomotor portfolio as required by the state of Michigan. That's something new that they now have to document a portfolio to demonstrate their skills as far as that goes. I do feel like there's a difference in simulations versus scenarios versus skill practice. You should see a little bit different of approach. I know almost every instructor that says they do simulations, when you ask them what does that mean, they say, well, we take the mannequin out and we put it on the table and we use it. That's not a simulation, folks. That's a scenario on a table with a mannequin. A simulation is something that should be immersive, that should trigger senses and things of that nature. We'll get into that later as well too. And then role-playing. Role-playing is a really nice way of being able to get students to effectively understand what's going on from a patient assessment perspective, a history gathering perspective, medications, right? Classifications of drugs. Those things all play a role when they're trying to be able to understand and recall and create that scenario or simulation where they're playing patient. That's a great segue into our affective aspect. Because one of the first ways is modeling behaviors, right? So part of that really should be role playing, because it has such an impact on the affective domain content, where you can put your students into a situation where you're going to push them, put pressure on them to exert those non-professional behaviors that we're looking for, or giving them an opportunity to shine when put under that pressure, that they don't give in and that they actually can demonstrate that behavior. Another one is sensitivity training. And I'm not talking like desensitization, right? I'm talking about making sure they understand that there's a time and a place for silence. There's a time and a place to have a supporting touch to a patient, or that there's a time and a place for those things. And sometimes it requires us to be a little bit more sensitive. I will tell you, the career that you're all in, and the students that you're going to get into, your students are going to be much more sensitive than those that are seasoned, experienced providers. The field of EMS, the field of public safety or healthcare, naturally seems to kind of pull at that and desensitize us to situations that normally, in a normal human life, they wouldn't have that same level of response. So that's important for us to recognize that sometimes we need to lean into that for our advanced providers, and sometimes for our new providers we have to be more sensitive to that. And then awareness courses, right? One of the big things right now is implicit bias. Everybody has some bias, right? We talked about that in our cultural lecture. It's important that you recognize that and do what you can to be able to put that aside. Now, we also have to be able to evaluate these domains of learning. So again, to recap, we've talked about the psychomotor, the affective, and the cognitive learning domains. We've talked about how each of those have multiple steps within, but then there's still that general three flow. Again, knowledge to application to problem solving, that all three should go through. The question becomes, how do you evaluate that? We're generally really good at evaluating the cognitive domain. We give quizzes and tests and standardized tests and things that have been peer reviewed. Oh, great, all well and dandy. But that's one view, that's one portion of the whole, right? How do we make sure that the psychomotor aspect is also being done, and even more difficultly, the affective learning domain? So we got to remember, again, learning with one domain is often interdependent with other domains. No one person learns only in one domain. Everything is multimodal. It requires different aspects, all of which are going to be put together as a whole. But for simplistic reasons, from an educational standpoint for us, we've got to be able to break it down and understand that, yes, that there's going to be some overlap on these different learning domains, especially when we're targeting specific assessments. It's important. Like, for example, psychomotor skill is required to have cognitive knowledge, right? You can't just say, all right, grab a needle and stick it in them, right? Well, what needle, what syringe, what fluid, what's appropriate, how do you clean the site? Those are things that we can't just learn necessarily through just doing. Again, that's the interdependence from one to the next, right? It requires parts and concepts and processes all to kind of focus around those levels. Now, some educational learning models, are going to encourage an environment where students do a high amount of experimenting as a means to learn. I think that's great. It's going to be most successful with those students who possess a very high level of self-directiveness. Most of the time, your adults, learners, not a big problem. Some of your younger students, maybe not so much. They may require a little bit more motivation or support. When you're looking at utilizing this, you definitely need to make sure that you're there to guide and mentor your students. Your role as an educator, depending on your approach and your style, really should be more, again, a student-centered approach, focusing on their success, not a teacher-centered approach where you're the sun and everything revolves around you. It should be focused on the student, right? And we also want to make sure that we're there to be a facilitator in their learning. And a lot of times that you can see that that'll happen in this case. We also want to do things where we review the course and lesson objectives to determine the appropriate depth and breadth. Try to teach one level deeper than the objectives really require, right? Because your memory is going to degrade. You're going to lose information. You're going to lose content. As a student will, just because as a sponge, you can only absorb so much, and students will have knowledge gaps in their knowledge because something happened and all of a sudden it's gone, because their phone buzzed, or they are hungry, or they've got something going on at home. So remember that you need to make sure you're prepared to understand the depth and the breadth of the content in which you're going to instruct. Now, I'm a big believer, I believe this is from Edgar Dale, but this is what we remember about. And I've referenced this several times already, but I want to kind of quantify it for you now. So there's research that's going to show us that the more senses that we use as learners, the more that we are engaged in the learning process, the more material that we're going to retain, and the not only the more we'll retain, but the longer we're going to retain it. One of the presentations I've done before for a number of different groups at the IC conferences and at a couple state EMS meetings is focusing on engagement. After about 15 minutes of instruction, let's say lecture, almost immediately you're going to lose the majority of your process, right? The learning, they're not going to be able to retain that after 15 minutes without being engaged. So if you're passively going to lecture at folks for 8 hours a day, they're going to remember the first 15 minutes, and after that, almost everything is going to be just completely a waste. But we also got to recognize the way in which we remember information, how we put forth our content to ensure that our students are going to get more out of it. So first and foremost, we retain about 10% of what we read. So if you're trying to make sure your students are going to do well, think again if you're expecting them, one, to just read. And number two, expect them not to retain much, because they're only going to retain about 10% of what they read. Now, in a form of a discussion like this, where maybe you're listening to a podcast, they're going to be about 20% of what they hear, they'll absorb, right? So if they see graphics or images or slideshows, well, about 30%. And then, hey, even if we see and hear through a lecture like we are right now, you're watching and you're seeing and you're listening, 40%, 60% that we're not going to be able to fully retain. I'm not okay with a 40% on a test. I think that's pretty poor if that's the job performance I'm doing as an instructor. So I got to be able to do something more than that. 70% is a huge jump, a 30% jump when we can describe and talk about it. That's the importance of discussion. But even more so, if we can get the students to be able to say and do what we're doing or teaching, in essence, letting them instruct or engaging them in such a fashion that they get to talk and they get to describe and they get to interact with each other in a meaningful way, we can climb this, we can scale this retention of content much, much better to better support our students. Every 15 minutes, I try to make sure that I do something to ask a question, to engage a student, to show something new, whatever it might be. Every 15 minutes. I also give a break every hour to my students, because I know they need to have that mental brain rest in between to be able to come back, to be able to be fresh again. That's really important. It doesn't have to be something that's crazy and complex for you to do, but it is really important that you try to do as much as you can to engage the students in the multiple ways, the different modalities in which they prefer to learn, because you will definitely have a higher retention of material and a higher engagement within your program. Now, the cognitive knowledge of a skill does not imply competency in the performance of the skill, right? I can talk to you about how to do everything, but I got to be able to do it. If I can't demonstrate the skill, right? If I can't integrate the skill practice and performance aspect along with the knowledge together, then I'm not really getting into that psychomotor learning domain. That's important. Some students are very, very book smart, and they have absolutely zero practical skills. They struggle significantly to deploy what they know. They can do well on a test. They can do well on book work or school, class things like that. But when you're putting them into a real life situation, a performance-based examination, they're going to struggle. And it's going to be our job to make sure that we recognize that, yes, you can be really smart and not necessarily be able to apply things very, very effectively. And we want to work to try to combine those things together to make sure that skill, knowledge, and practice and performance are all on the same page. Now, in your objectives, page 249 to 247, you'll find the affective learning domains, the affective evaluation. I would encourage you to not necessarily go to that specific page, but to go to your 2002 DOT guidelines on your Moodle course, and then go down to the appendices where you can actually see that affective learning domain evaluation tool there. Now again, when we talk about more content at evaluating the domains of learning that occur, we're going to get into more depth in this later on. But there's a couple ways in which we can do that. Cognitive, probably the most common, is going to be written exams. Maybe you're going to do some static presentations or oral examinations. Those are probably the most common ways we see the cognitive learning domain assessed, right? So again, it's going to be written, static presentations, like maybe an oral presentation of some kind, or a static presentation like a poster board or something along those lines. With the psychomotor, now we're talking about competency skills exams. We're talking about scenario-based exams, and then clinical or field evaluations as well. The other part that we oftentimes don't think of, and I do appreciate CAHEP and COAMP's accreditation for this, and that's on-the-job performance. We don't oftentimes think about that. We get through our students and we train them up and we send them out, and we said, yeah, you've got skill competency, scenario competency, clinical and field competencies. But what's their job performance like 6 months to a year afterwards? National accreditation requires us to be able to do graduate surveys and find that information out from graduates and their employers to see what it looks like. We're now beginning to deploy that now through all the ranks of our training, MFR through paramedic, because we want to see how well our skills and attributes that we're training in class, how well and how long does that hold on as they transition into the field. For your affective aspects, your class participation is really important. The more you make your class interactive, the better off you're going to be when it comes to dealing with your students. We also know that things like leaderships, utilizing a command structure, utilizing some way in which you can actually go through and have them demonstrate leadership capabilities. We do that here at KCC through a command structure in the class where there's classroom commanders and squad leaders and squad members, and each have roles and job descriptions. We also do a number of components in simulation with leadership, both team member and team leader, first responder and EMT or paramedics. All those things play a role because leadership, believe it or not, you look at all the textbooks that are out there, there is very, very little information about leadership in the core content. And I think that's kind of silly because realistically it should be at the forefront of what we're doing. And then peer supervision. Peer pressure works to a certain extent. You got to be careful, it's a slippery slope, but it does make a big difference. And when peer supervision or peer instruction, peer evaluations are very powerful. It goes back to that level of teaching, right? The show one, do one, teach one, getting them to be able to understand and evaluate, synthesize those highest levels of balloons that we're looking at. That really helps us when we actually are able to do so by effectively teaching something. And then we have role modeling, obviously for behavior, and then adherence to policies and procedures, right? And again, we'll talk about other aspects throughout the course as we go through about ways in which you can engage those different domains. We also have to recognize that most students have a presence or an aptitude for one learning domain versus another, right? Nobody truly learns in just one way, but they're going to have a preference, and that's normal, right? Generally speaking, I would say a lot of them are going to say, well, we really like the practical aspect. We like the psychomotor learning domain. Why? Because it's fun and it's cool and it's doing it. But you got to build to that. I'll give you an example. When I taught at a previous institution, I was trying to come up with unique ways to apply this crazy stuff that I had been learning as I was taking some classes and learning more about active instruction, active learning. So I decided I was going to go ahead and I was going to move to scenario-based learning in class, and I was really going to double down on that and get away from doing traditional lectures or PowerPoints. Students liked it. It was a good experience, but the outcomes were horrible. The students didn't know what they needed to know. They didn't understand the basis of information, right? They didn't have the knowledge, the basic facts and figures. They didn't comprehend those things fully. And so when we got into application, they could do the skills, but they didn't understand why, how, or when to deploy some of those aspects. And that really led to just a lot of confusion. You can go back to something like that and say, okay, well, there's ways in which you can make that work, and I'm sure that there is, but to just lay into one domain I didn't really have a lot of foresight into what we were going to get into for that. And so it's one of those things. Education is an art, right? There's some science and there's some art to it, but it's really about finding what works best. But you gotta be careful because we just don't want to experiment on our students. We'll talk about that again in our research module. And then again, minimum competency is what we're going for, right? Minimum competencies to be able to graduate an entry-level competency provider. That's the goal of initial education. For continuing education, again, it's going to be to maintain competency or to improve competencies to maintain the skills and practice that are necessary in the profession of EMS. And so I hope that this lesson was helpful for you. Again, the importance behind understanding Bloom's taxonomy. Just quickly, I'll reiterate these things. There are the three primary levels of progression that occur within learning. Again, we know that we have the knowledge level, we have the application, and the problem solving. That's the natural flow of learning that we're going to look at, right? Again, there's really no true dividing lines in that process. That's just a way for us to be able to comprehend learning a little bit better, because every individual student will approach that growth in a different way. The second aspect to think of is that there are different levels of Bloom. So you have your cognitive, your psychomotor, and your affective learning. Each one of those domains will have specific strategies or steps within that, again, you're going to need to make sure that you understand to show that progression from lower level to higher order thinking as you go through. And then again, remember, we're going to come back to this when we start thinking about writing goals and objectives, because in order for us to have meaningful goals and objectives to really use and measure with our assessments for our learning, we've got to be able to tie that back to the content that we're instructing and the ways in which we're instructing, the levels of learning that we're going to be instructing to determine are our students meeting those appropriate outcomes. So I hope that this was a valuable lesson for you, and we'll catch you guys here on the next lesson.